Hi, my name is Simon, and I will present the overall recap about Corda database and what's new in Corda 4, and mostly about updating from Corda 3 to Corda 4. So the agenda is what to do when you want just set up Corda from the scratch using against a database. Then how to upgrade from Corda 3 to Corda 4 in terms of the database. Then the possible way of upgrading Corda open source to Corda Enterprise. And how to actually develop Corda which has custom tables. And migration from H2 database to over database. Mostly everything is covered on a documentation page. It may be scattered in different places. It will be reorganized, restructured. So there is nothing specific here which is not covered on the table. So first, about functionalities, so any Corda 3, version 3 open source can be upgraded to version 4, which are running against H2. The same for open source Corda running against PostgreSQL. Just to mention, we are not really supporting open source running with PostgreSQL. But this is possible option as well. Then upgrading H2 on Enterprise, upgrading Enterprise 3 to 4 works, and upgrading 3 to 4. But the straightforward way is to when you actually upgrade using the same database vendor. So you have existing Enterprise 3 using Azure SQL, and you just want to upgrade to Enterprise 4. And this is more complicated stuff. So when you actually want to upgrade between versions. So you are still using between open source and enterprise version. So you can easily move from H2 open source to enterprise H2. And if you are running open source against PostgreSQL, you can easily move to enterprise PostgreSQL. The way to migrate your H2 database to any other database vendor, this is actually not really specific to open source and H2. We are evaluating the third-party tool for this, and maybe we will support using our toolset. The problem from migration between different database vendors are that we store a lot of data in binary formats, and this is not easily to migrate. You can't export binary format to an SQL file and run on different database. And if you want to migrate to other database vendors, like between Azure to Oracle and something like that, most likely they are supporting such migration using their tooling. Okay. So now how to install database? Well, how to install Corda against database? So if you are using enterprise or open source Corda with H2 database, there is nothing to install. You just run the Corda, and it starts H2 database out of box. You may optionally configure some options like H2 port, some security restrictions. When you install Corda Enterprise, there are actually many ways to install, but we divided possible tracks in 2 ways. So if if you just want to try something, we provide scripts. So first, you need to create a database with user and schema permissions. So this is nothing specific to Corda. So this is the first step. And when you want just to try, you can create a database user with administrative permissions, which can delete, drop tables. Then you need to add configuration to the node to point to the database, to point to right schema and other credentials. And then you just run the Corda node. And upon the startup, the node will detect that this is a fresh installation and will create all tables while starting. So for production system, this is not really, maybe not allowed. So as before, you need to create database permissions users with probably more restricted user, which doesn't have permission to delete tables, for example. Then it's typically database administrator can use our tool to create DDL schema. So Corda is not shipped with any DDL schema. You can think about this, we embedded DDL in our product. So if database administrator want to see what will be actually run against database, he can extract this DDL script from our Corda management tool. He needs to connect to the given database as well for this. Then he can examine such script and manually execute the scripts, and it will create the database. As well, the node needs, in point 4, the node needs to be configured and started. And in this mode, the node will not create any database tables. They are created in point 3. And for example, as it's written, we provide example scripts. So I would show. So for example, for SQL Azure, for development usage, those scripts are ready to use, except you need to change password probably. So typically you will create a login user with specific database, then you need to log into different database, create permissions. And then for each database, the specific configuration matching the script is presented. And typically, you need to set database user, password, transaction isolation level, schema. That's all. And the interesting thing is, okay, so how in point 3, how the Corda node here creates the database. So we are using third-party liquid-based library, and the database schema is actually expressed in XML. It can be differently. So the aim is to be portable across different database vendors. And when the node starts, it just scans for all scripts and compares the current state on the database. So there is specific database changelog table the control table for liquid base. So when it detects that it has more scripts than already recorded, it will try to run those scripts. If the node is set in development use, yeah, on production, most likely the node will stop, will not start, and will say that okay, my code is not, it's out of date with the database. Well, the database is out of date with the code. You need to update the database. And for enterprise, when you develop Corda apps, we require those liquid-based scripts also for Corda apps. For open source, they are not used. Okay, so now about upgrading. So if you are using open source or enterprise, when you want to upgrade with H2 database, you just essentially need to stop the Corda node and deploy new Corda jar. For some specific upgrades, like from 3 to 4, with more complicated migration internally, we require to drain the flows, so there is no pending checkpoints on the database. The reason is that the, for example, binary format internally has changed and it needs to start from fresh. When you actually run Corda Enterprise, it's more complicated. So for development use as well, you need to, in point 1, ensure there's no flows running, stop the Corda node, deploy new Corda, and the node will detect what it's missing, what tables are missing, and will create those tables. In production system, as before, most likely the database administrator will use our Corda management tool to connect to database and get the DDL script. This script will contain the difference between the new additions which are required. Then this DDL script needs to be executed, and for this upgrade to 4, the administrator needs to run the management tool one more time to perform some more complicated migration, which cannot be actually expressed via DDL. So this involves some Java code running and changing formats of data or extracting some data. And after restarting, because the node doesn't have any permission to create the tables, and everything was updated in point 4 and 5, there is nothing for Corda to run. So the liquid base is actually run in point 3 and maybe run in point 5. So in point 4 you have just a plain DDL SQL script created based on liquid base and our tool. There is also option, but you could skip the step 3 and 4 and just execute everything in step 5. So you actually don't see the DDL. The tool will create on your own. And most likely the reason for this production system is that the database administrator will be connecting to the database from different machine using different database user, which has permission to alter tables and this. And in point 7, the node is running just with database user, which can select, delete, and insert data. So the node cannot manipulate, alter the schema.
So just on that, if the migration is more complex, like I'm thinking of all the ones that James put in a while ago for the relevant checks and things, if the business logic that's been run by Liquid-based requires Java to run, is there ever a situation where that needs to run under higher privileges, or it would only ever need to run under the privileges the node uses normally?
So this is a good question. So if in step 5, if this is mostly the internal data migration, so no new tables because they should be created in point 4, so then it could be run by the node as well. But in the documentation, we will just stick to 2 tracks just to simplify usage.
Okay, one thing we might want to watch out for or be ready for is if we ask the DBAs to run at step 5, even under reduced privileges.
Yes.
Okay. They may ask, what's this Java code doing? Show me what it's going to do before I run it. Whereas if it doesn't require any additional privileges, just running it the first time the node starts automatically at step 7, so the DBAs don't even know it's happening because it's got nothing to do with the administration of the database, it's just internal node housekeeping. That might avoid some difficult conversations for the solution engineers. So maybe something to catch up with later, but it may be that we want to hide some of that in like first run for the node rather than ask the DBAs to get involved.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and now when you want to actually move from open source to enterprise, and actually this is most likely concerning if you are running Corda open source against Postgres or any other non-H2 database. Because, as I said before, for H2 there is nothing to manage. The node will manage itself. So again, so for development use, you just stop the Corda node, deploy new Corda jar. You may need most likely update the node.conf, and then when the node is restarted, it will detect that it will create the new tables which are in enterprise and not in open source. This update, it's actually even possible between Corda 3 and Corda 4 as well. On production system, again, the database administrator will perform the update, and it's mistake. So in point 3, it will run the tool against the live database, and it will receive the difference between open source and enterprise, and then this additional DDL needs to be run. And as well, the node needs to be, probably node configuration needs to be updated. So this is more complicated. So for open source and for H2 database, if you develop Corda with some custom states, JPA entity, it needs to have a backing table. And for H2 and open source, this is typically created by Hibernate during node startup. But this is not really advice for a production system. And in this case, it's always better to create manually DDL script and run before. And even if your Corda has liquid-based script, it will be ignored in open source. And for enterprise, contrary, you need to have liquid-based script. And if your Corda doesn't have liquid-based script, it will not create those tables, and you will get exception. And when you develop scripts, as I showed before, liquid-based, you can also use Corda database management utility to help you to get XML script. So in this case, there are two contexts when you run Corda database management, as a helper tool or as the operational tool. Probably the developer of Corda needs to be aware of liquid-based and needs to read about liquid-based and how to correctly create a liquid-based script. We have basic instruction on our web page as well. And when you already have a database administrator or operator is running Corda Enterprise and he or she gets new Corda, the installation is exactly the same as for normal database node installation. So for test use, you just deploy new Corda, restart the data node, and the new tables will be created. For production system, the database administrator may use the same Corda database management tool to get DDL, execute DDL, then deploy Corda and restart Corda node. And as well, when you create a new version of existing Corda, and if there are any changes to JPA entities, each time you need to create additional new liquid-based script, and this script needs to be added to the Corda. So essentially, it's documented on our webpage. This script needs to be compiled together with the Corda, or it can be compiled as separate jar. Corda. And for node operator, when it received the new upgraded Corda, is essentially the same process, or just plain dropping new Corda and restarting, or just extracting DDL, running manually. The more complicated case is when you actually have existing open source node. And you want to, when you have existing open source Corda, by open source I mean it was running always on open source node and it never had liquid-based scripts. But now retrospectively you want to add those scripts. So you need to create those scripts using, for example, this database management tool as a helper. But this is manual step. You need to actually then run this tool to get your DDL script and extract some specific statements, like all statements which are inserting to database changelog. And then you need to provide this specific script to database administrator. So the reason is that if you are already have running Corda, you already have created the tables for this Corda. And when you would like to start a Corda Enterprise, it will not find anything in its logs that this table was created. So you need to trick the liquid base and retrospectively add this log, the statements to the log that those tables have been created. So this is this manual part of upgrading. And so again, so when you have open source Corda and you want to upgrade to 4 and you have already custom Corda, so you just follow the standard OS to Enterprise upgrade I'd covered before, and then for all custom Corda which didn't have liquid base before, well, for all Corda, because on open source there is no liquid base, you need to create these entries in database changelog, and then you need to start the Corda node. And the last point, migration from H2 to non-H2 database. As I covered before, this is there is no standard way to export the binary data using just the SQL script, and we are currently evaluating third-party tool which allows you to migrate from H2 to Oracle PostgreSQL server. We probably in the future will support our own tool to make such migration. And yeah, that would be all for this. And so I didn't cover any details here, but they are extensively as explained on documentation, and there is or will be a page if you just want to install fresh database, what to do. If you just want to upgrade Corda 3 to Corda 4, just follow these steps. And this database management tool, which I mentioned, is described as well separately, and how to develop your liquid-based scripts. Liquid-based scripts is also covered there. And yeah, that's all.
Thanks. That's really comprehensive. Thank you. Probably the only thing I saw that we don't yet have an answer to that people will ask is that very last one on migration from H2 to non-H2. You said it's still under evaluation. What's the progress so far? I know there was that tool you found that you were trying. Do we think? How confident are we we'll have an IGA?
So one drawback of this tool is that it can be run only on a Windows machine. It can be scripted, so but probably we would need to add some automated test regressions to be sure that it always works. So that's the reason. Yeah, it's still in progress. The problem with H2 is that other database vendors like Oracle doesn't support migration from H2 to their database. So
What's your sense if we have, okay, so it's a third-party tool, people have to pay for it, it only runs on Windows, but if someone's willing to pay the $600, run on Windows, we could, if the customer asked us, there are some instructions we could give them. Yeah, okay.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so any more questions?
Simon Lamar, I have a question. So we're saying like a DBA to set up the database, is it required to run either the database migration tool and get the DDLs, or the DBA would have to create Liquid-based specific XML DDL format in order to set up the database for the node?
No, the DBA doesn't create anything. It just use our tool, and this tool will output DDL. So there is no manual step involved for DBA administrator.
Okay, so I guess I'm asking the question, is that the only way to do it? Meaning, if I have a Corda app and I know the database schema structure for it, as a DBA, can I create the DDLs separate from Corda and create those tables in the database, or I need to use the database migration tool?
Well, you are actually using database management tool only to output DDL script, but then you are manually, the administrator will connect using own tool and will run this DDL script. So, so it's not. Does it answer your question? No.
Yeah, well, I think the one piece is I'm just trying to isolate. Without the database migration tool, can I build my database schema, or I need to use the tool?
Well, we don't distribute separate DDL script. So,
okay.
So that's the reason. So it's like we are internally shipped this script with the tool, and if you just want to see this script, you just run and output this script.
Okay. All right. So the script sounds like the tool is essential. It sounds like
yes,
we need the tool.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if let's say if you are DB administrator and you have 20 nodes to set up, you just run this tool once. You have the schema, and you will just run the same script against different schemas. Yeah.
Got it.
Mm.
Okay. Thank you. I have one last question. If no one else asking, is the tool itself all-encompassing when I actually run it against a different version? Meaning, if I'm on Corda version 3 and I upgrade to 3.2, I run the tool, and then I upgrade to 4. Let's say I go directly from 3 to 4. Can I just use the 4.0 tool, and that will give me the updated DDL I need with the difference in between, or do I need to run them individually in succession, like iterative updates?
So no, so you can skip the version. So the tool will actually detect all differences and will generate the addition. So you most likely you can move from, well, not most likely, but you can have Corda node 3.2 and you can move to 4.1 or 4.1 to 4.5. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, so no more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good.